December 24th, 2024. The wind is howling against the drafty windows, but the real chill is coming from inside the dining room. My name is Simpson, and I am watching my family drink wine and appraise my home like it is a carcass. They think the farmhouse is a worthless liability, a rotting pile of wood standing in the way of a $2.5 million developer payout. They came here to force a sale to bury the past and cash out their inheritance. But they forgot one thing. You cannot sell what you do not own, and they have no idea whose name is actually on the deed. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The axe handle was smooth hickory polished by my grandfather's hands first, and now mine. It was 6 in the morning, and the sun was just a gray bruise on the eastern horizon. The air was 12 degrees. I could feel the cold coming up through the soles of my boots, seeking the heat of my socks. I set the round of oak on the splitting stump. It was frozen hard. When I brought the axe down, the wood did not split clean. It popped with a sound like a rifle shot, one half spinning off into the snow, the other teetering on the block. I breathed out a white plume that hung in the still air. My shoulders burned. It was good pain. It meant I was doing something that mattered. The furnace had quit again sometime in the night, and the farmhouse was holding its breath, waiting for the warmth I had to make myself. I stacked the wood in the canvas carrier and walked back to the house. The porch steps creaked under my weight. I had fixed the third step in October, but the frost heave had pushed the stringer up again. The house was fighting the winter, and the winter was winning. I kicked the snow off my boots against the frame and went inside. The kitchen smelled of cold ash and the sage I had rubbed into the turkey earlier. I knelt by the wood stove, my knuckles red and raw, and fed the kindling. The fire caught yellow and hungry. I added the oak. The metal ticked as it expanded. I stayed there for a moment, letting the heat thaw the stiffness in my fingers. My hands were rough. The nails were cut short, the cuticles stained with soot and grease. They were not the hands of a 28-year-old woman who should be in an office in Chicago. They were the hands of a woman who kept this house standing. Grandpa Arthur was already in his chair by the window. He was wrapped in 3 blankets, his eyes milky with cataracts, staring out at the white fields. He didn't move when I came in, but his hand twitched on the armrest. I walked over and touched his shoulder. The wool of his sweater was thin. "It's heating up, Grandpa," I said. "I know, Annie," he said. His voice was like dry leaves. "Is the road clear? Clear enough?" "They'll be here soon," he said, "with their noise." "Yes," I said, "they will." I went to the sink to wash the soot off. The water from the tap was so cold it made my bones ache. I looked at the turkey sitting on the counter. It was a 20-pound bird raised 3 farms over. I had plucked it myself. It wasn't wrapped in plastic. It was real food. I began to peel the potatoes, the knife rhythmic against the skins. This was the bargain. I did the work. I kept the pipes from bursting. I made sure Grandma Elise took her heart pills and Grandpa didn't wander off into the snow. In exchange, I got to live in a house that was falling down, in a town that was dying, with a bank account that hovered just above zero. My parents called it a waste of potential. I called it duty. But today, with the wind rattling the single-pane windows, it felt heavy. Grandma Elise came down the stairs, slowly gripping the banister. I wiped my hands and went to help her. She was small now, shrunken by age, but her eyes were still sharp like a hawk's. "Did you salt the walk, Anne?" she asked. "Yes, Grandma." "Good. Linda will complain if she ruins her shoes." "Linda will complain anyway," I said. Grandma smiled, a small tightening of her lips. "Be nice, it's Christmas." "I'm always nice," I said. "You're tired," she said, touching my face. Her hand was cold. "You do too much." "Someone has to." The sound of engines cut through the quiet. Not the rattle of a pickup truck, but the low, expensive hum of precision engineering. I went to the window. 2 cars were coming up the long driveway, kicking up plumes of pristine white powder. The first was a black Mercedes SUV, large and aggressive. That was my parents, Robert and Linda. Behind it was a red Porsche Macan looking ridiculous and low against the snowbanks. Chloe, my younger sister. She had bought it 2 months ago, or rather the bank had bought it, and she was paying for the privilege of driving it. I watched them park. They didn't park near the barn where the ground was solid. They parked right in front of the walkway blocking the view of the fields. The doors opened. Robert stepped out first. He was wearing a camel hair coat that probably cost more than the new well pump I needed. He looked at the house not with affection, but with the squint of a man estimating demolition costs. Linda followed, wrapping a fur scarf tight around her neck. She took a step, slipped slightly on a patch of ice I had missed, and grabbed Robert's arm. I could see her mouth moving, saying something sharp. Then Chloe emerged from the Porsche. She was wearing heels. In December. On a farm. She looked like an ornament, shiny and fragile. I opened the front door before they could knock. The cold air rushed in, clashing with the warmth I had just built. "Merry Christmas," I said. Robert stomped his feet on the mat, bringing slush onto the hardwood I had just swept. "Jesus, Anne, it's freezing out here. Why didn't you clear the drive wider? I nearly scratched the paint on the brambles." "The plow guy only does one pass," I said. "Come in." Linda came in, smelling of expensive perfume and hairspray. She looked at me, her eyes sweeping from my messy bun down to my flannel shirt and the work boots. She didn't hug me. She just sighed a short exhale through her nose. "Anne," she said, "you look rugged." "I've been chopping wood, Mom. The furnace is out." "Again?" Robert asked. He was peeling off his gloves. "I told you last year this place is a money pit. You're throwing good money after bad fixing that ancient boiler." "It's not the boiler, it's the relay," I said. "I ordered the part. It'll be here Tuesday." "So we freeze until Tuesday," Chloe said, pushing past me. She was carrying a bottle of wine and her phone. She didn't look at me. She looked at the signal bars on her screen. "Is the Wi-Fi down? I have 0 bars." "The wind probably knocked the dish," I said. "Hello to you too, Chloe." "Hi," she said, not looking up. "God, it smells like smoke in here. Is the flue open?" "It's a wood stove, Chloe. It smells like wood." I took their coats. The fabric was heavy, rich wool and cashmere. I hung them on the pegs next to my canvas Carhartt jacket, which was stained with oil and mud. The contrast was violent. Their coats looked like they belonged in a boutique. Mine looked like it belonged in a ditch. "Where are Mom and Dad?" Linda asked, looking around the living room with a critical eye. She ran a finger over the top of the bookshelf, checking for dust. "By the fire," I said. "They're waiting for you." We moved into the living room. The dynamic shifted instantly. When it was just me and the grandparents, the house was a home. Now with my parents and sister standing in the center of the room, it felt like a waiting room for a disaster. The furniture looked too old. The wallpaper looked too peeled. Their presence made the poverty of the farm visible in a way I usually ignored. "Merry Christmas, folks," Robert boomed. He used his boardroom voice, loud and false. He went to shake Grandpa's hand. Grandpa didn't stand up. He just offered a limp hand. "Hello, Robert," Grandpa said. "You're looking frail, Dad," Robert said. "Eating enough, Anne? Are you feeding them enough protein?" "I'm cooking a 20-pound turkey, Dad," I said from the doorway. "Store-bought has more vitamins," Linda said. She was hovering over Grandma, picking at the blanket on Grandma's lap. "This wool is scratchy, Elise. I brought you a nice fleece throw. Why don't we switch this out?" "I like this blanket," Grandma said firmly. "Anne knit it for me." Linda dropped the fabric as if it were contagious. "Oh, well, it's charming in a rustic way." I went back to the kitchen. I needed to escape. I could hear them in the other room, the murmur of their voices rising and falling. They weren't talking to the grandparents. They were talking at them. I picked up the potato peeler again. My hands were shaking slightly, not from the cold this time, but from the adrenaline of holding back. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell them that I was the one who woke up every 2 hours when Grandpa coughed. I was the one who managed the pills. I was the one who cleaned the messes they were too proud to even acknowledge. But I didn't. I peeled the potato. The skin curled away in long brown ribbons. Chloe came into the kitchen a moment later. She didn't offer to help. She leaned against the counter watching me work. She poured herself a glass of the wine she had brought, not offering me any. "So," she said, "still playing Little House on the Prairie. Someone has to take care of them, Chloe. They should be in a home, Anne. A nice one, with doctors." "They want to be here," I said. "This is their home." Chloe laughed. It was a sharp, brittle sound. "This isn't a home. It's a carcass. Look at the ceiling, Anne. There's a water stain the size of a tire. I'm fixing it." "You're always fixing it," she said. She took a sip of wine. "You know my friend Jessica is looking for a PA. In the city. It pays actual money. You could stop this." She gestured vaguely at me at the turkey at the walls. "I'm fine," I said. "You're nearly 30, and you live with your grandparents," Chloe said. "You're not fine, you're hiding." She walked out, leaving the scent of expensive grapes and judgment in the air. I gripped the knife harder. The turkey sat on the counter cold and pale. Outside, the wind picked up howling around the corners of the house. It was going to be a long day. I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me, the timber and the stone and the history. They thought it was worthless. They thought I was worthless for staying. I threw the potato into the pot of water. It splashed cold drops hitting my face. I wiped them away. They felt like tears, but I wasn't crying. I didn't have time to cry. I had dinner to cook. The kitchen was getting hot. The wood stove was finally drawing properly banking coals that radiated a fierce, dry heat, and the oven had been running at 400 degrees for hours. I opened the oven door to baste the bird. The skin was blistering, turning a deep mahogany. I tilted the pan, gathered the juices with the bulb baster, and washed them over the breast meat. The smell was heavy roasted meat, thyme, and onions. It was the smell of every Christmas I could remember. Chloe was standing by the island watching me. She had finished her first glass of wine and was pouring a second. The bottle was a Cabernet. She had brought something with a gold wire mesh around the bottle. She didn't offer to pour one for me. "You know," she said, swirling the red liquid, "the Porsche has launch control, 0 to 60 in 4.3 seconds. It's insane." "The roads are iced over, Chloe," I said, closing the oven door. "You can't do 60 anywhere around here." "It's the principle of it," she said. "It's about having the power when you need it. The lease is a steal, honestly. Robert helped me negotiate the residual." Her phone buzzed on the countertop. It was face up. The screen lit up bright against the worn laminate. The name on the caller ID wasn't a name. It was a number, an 800 number. I knew that prefix. I had seen it on the bills Grandpa used to hide in his desk drawer before I took over the finances. It was a collections agency. Chloe's hand shot out faster than I expected, and she flipped the phone face down. She didn't answer it. She didn't decline it. She just smothered it. "Popular today?" I asked. She took a large sip of wine, leaving a red crescent on her lip. "Just work. They don't respect holidays. You wouldn't know about that. Farm hours are what, sunup to sundown?" "Something like that," I said. "Must be nice," she said. "No emails, no pressure." She looked at her manicured nails, then back at her phone, which had stopped buzzing. Her eyes were tight at the corners. She was terrified. I didn't say anything. I just turned back to the stove to stir the gravy. The flour and fat were browning in the cast iron skillet. I added the stock slowly, the steam rising in a hiss. Robert walked in then. He didn't come to the stove to smell the food. He walked to the window above the sink and pressed his thumb into the wooden sill. He pushed hard. I saw the wood give slightly. "Dry rot," he announced. He wasn't talking to me, really. He was talking to the room. "The moisture barrier on the exterior is shot. You've got water intrusion here, Anne." "It's just surface dampness from the condensation," I said. "I stripped and varnished it last summer." "It's soft," he insisted. He wiped his thumb on his cashmere coat, then thought better of it and grabbed a paper towel. "This whole north wall is probably compromised. You have any idea what it costs to reframe a load-bearing wall these days? Lumber futures are up." "We aren't reframing the wall, Dad." "Not yet," he said. He turned and looked at the ceiling where a hairline crack ran from the crown molding toward the light fixture. Foundation settling, too. I felt it when I walked in. The floor joists are sagging. This place is a liability waiting to happen. If one of those beams goes while Mom and Dad are sleeping. He let the sentence hang there, a threat disguised as concern. Dinner is ready, I said. Grab the wine. I carried the turkey to the dining room. The platter was heavy enough to strain my forearms. I set it down in the center of the table. I had set the table with Grandma's wedding china, the Haviland Limoges, with the delicate blue flowers. Some of the plates had chips on the edges, and the gold rim was worn away, where thumbs had held them for 60 years. My mother Linda was already seated. She was looking at her fork, running her thumb over the tines, checking for spots. It looks heavy, Linda said, eyeing the bird. Did you brine it? Dry brine, I said, for 2 days. Sodium is terrible for your father's blood pressure, she said. It's Christmas, Linda, Grandpa said. He was sitting at the head of the table, though he looked small in the high-backed chair. Grandma was to his right. I sat on his left. The family sat opposite us, a united front of criticism. I began to carve. The knife was sharp. I kept my tools in order, and the meat fell away in clean, steaming slices. I served the grandparents first, then the guests. Robert poured the wine. He filled his own glass to the brim, then topped off Linda's and Chloe's. He didn't offer any to the grandparents. Interferes with the meds, he muttered. I'll have a small glass, Robert, Grandma said. Better not, Mom. Don't want you getting dizzy and taking a tumble. Anne says the floors are uneven. He hadn't asked me about the floors. He was building a narrative. I poured grape juice for them instead. We ate in silence for a few minutes. The only sounds were the scrape of silver on china and the wind buffeting the glass. The food was good. The meat was moist, the gravy rich and dark. But the food didn't matter. It was just fuel for the argument that was coming. I could feel it building like the pressure in the boiler pipes. So, Linda said, wiping her mouth with a linen napkin. She reached into her purse, which she had kept by her feet, and pulled out a glossy brochure. She slid it across the tablecloth toward me. It knocked into the gravy boat. What is this? I asked. It's that complex I told you about. The Meridian, she said. Her voice took on a bright, artificial tone. I stopped by the leasing office last week. Anne, it's marvelous. They have a heated saltwater pool, a 24-hour fitness center, and it's gated. Keycard access only. You'd be safe. I'm safe here, I said. I didn't pick up the brochure. Safe. Chloe laughed. She was halfway through her third glass. Her cheeks were flushed. Anne, you're 20 miles from the nearest police station. If some drifter comes up that driveway, nobody would hear you scream. I have a shotgun, I said. And a dog. Buster is 12 years old and blind, Chloe said. And you're burying yourself here. Look at you. You're wearing flannel to Christmas dinner. You have dirt under your fingernails. It's garden soil, I said. From the root cellar. These are the potatoes we grew. I dug them up. That's exactly my point, Linda said. It's 2024. You shouldn't be digging potatoes. You have a degree, Anne, a business degree. You could be managing a team. Instead, you're managing dust. Robert cleared his throat. He had finished his wine and was pouring another. The bottle was empty. He looked irritated that it was gone. Your mother is right, he said. It's not just about you, Anne. It's about what's best for everyone. We've been looking at the numbers. What numbers? Grandpa asked. He hadn't touched his turkey. He was watching Robert. The upkeep, Robert said. He waved his fork around the room. Heating oil, property taxes, insurance. This place is hemorrhaging money, and for what nostalgia, you two. He nodded at the grandparents. Need professional care, round the clock. Anne does her best, I'm sure, but she's not a nurse. I take good care of them, I said. I kept my voice level. Grandpa's weight is up, Grandma's sores have healed. It's amateur hour, Robert said dismissively. And it's selfish. You're keeping them here in this drafty museum because you don't want to get a real job. That stung. I gripped my knife. I wanted to tell him about the nights I sat up reading to them because their eyes were too tired. About the baths. About the dignity of dying in your own bed instead of a sterile room that smelled of bleach and urine. But I knew it wouldn't matter. Robert didn't speak the language of care. He spoke the language of assets. There's something else, Robert said. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table. The alcohol had loosened him up, made him sloppy but also direct. I had a lunch meeting last week with a developer from the city, Vantage Properties. Robert, Grandma said warningly. No, listen, Mom. You need to hear this. The town is rezoning. The highway expansion is confirmed. It's coming right past the South Ridge within 3 years. You know what that means. Noise, pollution, trucks day and night. He paused for effect. But it also means opportunity, he said. Commercial zoning. This isn't just farmland anymore. It's a commercial corridor. We aren't selling, Grandpa said. You have to be realistic, Arthur. Robert's voice rose, cracking the polite veneer. You're 89. You can't manage 50 acres. You can't even manage the stairs. It's cruel to keep you here. It's a mercy to sell it. We get you into a top-tier facility, assisted living, the works. We get Anne set up in that apartment. We clear the debts. What debts? I asked. Robert blinked. He looked at Chloe, then back at me. The estate's debts, the hypothetical debts. End-of-life care is expensive, Anne. We're thinking ahead. He was lying. I could see it in the way his eyes darted to the side. It wasn't about the grandparents' care. It was about his own leverage. He was overextended. I had seen his name in the local business journal lawsuits, stalled projects, and Chloe's car, the lease they were drowning. They looked at the farmhouse walls and didn't see home. They saw a life raft. The offer is substantial, Robert said. He sat back looking satisfied, as if he had just closed a deal. It cleans everything up. We sell the land, flatten this fire hazard, and everyone walks away happy. I've already told them to draw up the papers, preliminary of course. But once the competency hearing is done, he stopped. He hadn't meant to say that part. The room went dead silent. Competency hearing? I asked. Robert waved a hand, a gesture meant to minimize the violence of his words. Just a formality, to ensure Dad and Mom are capable of making these decisions, since they clearly aren't grasping the financial reality. As their son, it's my duty to step in as power of attorney. You want to declare them incompetent so you can sell their house, I said. I want to save them from your mismanagement, Robert snapped, and from their own stubbornness. It's done, Anne. The logic is undeniable. The city is coming. The money is on the table. We're not going to let this place rot into the ground just so you can play farmer. Chloe nodded, her eyes bright and glassy. It's really for the best, Anne. You'll thank us later, when you're in a warm apartment with a real life. They looked at us. The three of them, Robert, Linda, Chloe. They were a wall of reasonable, logical greed. They had the suits, the cars, the vocabulary. They believed utterly and completely that they had already won. The farmhouse was just an asset to be liquidated, and I was just an obstacle to be removed. They picked up their wine glasses again, confident that the unpleasant part was over and the cashing out could begin. I looked at Grandma. She had stopped eating. Her hand was in her pocket, clutching something. She looked at me, and for a split second, I saw a spark of the woman who had once chased a bear off the porch with a broom. Robert checked his watch. I told the Vantage rep I'd call him tonight. Give him a verbal yes. He's working on the holiday just for this. Don't call him, I said. It's not your decision, sweetheart, Robert said, smiling with his teeth. It never was. The wind rattled the sash of the dining room window, a sudden gust that made the candle flames dance and cast long, wavering shadows against the wallpaper. Chloe looked at the wall, at a seam where the paper had curled back to reveal the gray plaster underneath. She picked at a loose thread on the tablecloth, pulling it until the fabric bunched. God, Anne, she said, her voice loud in the quiet room. Look at this place. Really look at it. It's depressing. It smells like old people and damp wool. How can you live like this? It's a house, Chloe, I said. It keeps the snow out. Barely, she said. She laughed a sound that lacked any humor. Once they're gone, and let's be honest, that's not far off, we're selling this heap immediately. I don't even want to walk through it to clear it out. We should just hire a service. 1-800-JUNK. Chloe, Grandma said softly. No, Grandma, it's true. Chloe continued, emboldened by the wine and Robert's earlier speech. It's barely worth the land it sits on. Actually, the house is a negative asset. It costs money to demolish it. You're practically a squatter here, Anne, just waiting for the inevitable. Robert nodded, slicing a piece of turkey he hadn't touched for 20 minutes. She's harsh, but she's right, Anne. Sentimental value doesn't pay the bills. The structure is a teardown. I've already had the preliminary assessment done by the guys at Vantage. They didn't even want to come inside. They stood by the road and looked at the grade. He took a sip of water, then looked around the table, making eye contact with everyone except the grandparents. He was holding court. Commercial grade, he said. That's the key phrase. The rezoning changes everything. If this was just agricultural land, we'd be lucky to get $5,000 an acre. But commercial frontage on the new bypass corridor. He paused. He wanted us to ask. He wanted the number to be pulled out of him like a prize. Linda bit. How much, Bob? Robert leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. He smiled, a genuine smile for the first time that day. The offer is on the table, he said. Cash, fast close, $2.5 million. The number hung in the air. It was a physical thing, heavy and golden. $2.5 million. I saw the calculation happen in real time on their faces. Linda's hand went to her throat, touching her pearls. She was thinking about the country club dues, the second mortgage on their house in the suburbs, that they never talked about, but I knew existed. Chloe's eyes widened. The hostility vanished, replaced by a hungry, vacuous shine. She wasn't seeing the peeling wallpaper anymore. She was seeing the payoff of her lease, the credit card balances wiped clean, a condo in the city. She did the math in her head, a third of the estate. $800,000. It was enough to save her. 2.5, Chloe whispered. Are you serious? Dead serious, Robert said. We can finally clean this mess up. We put Mom and Dad in the best facility in the state. Private rooms, 24-hour care, and the rest, well, the rest sets us all up. It's generational wealth, Anne. Real wealth, not potatoes. He looked at me with a mix of pity and triumph. He thought he was saving me. He thought that by destroying the only thing I loved, he was doing me a favor. So, Robert said, picking up his fork again, I'll have the papers drawn up next week. I'll need you to sign a quitclaim, Anne, just to clear up any residency issues since you've been living here. We'll cut you a check for your time, of course, for the caregiving. He said the word like it was a hobby, like I had been scrapbooking. The greed in the room was suffocating. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the vindication. They wanted the farm to be worth money, so they could justify ignoring it for 20 years. If it was sold, they hadn't neglected a home, they had invested in an asset. Grandma Elise put down her fork. The sound was sharp metal against china. It cut through the murmur of excited planning. She didn't look frail anymore. She sat up straight, her spine aligning with the back of the chair. She dabbed her mouth with her napkin and folded it neatly next to her plate. That is a good price, Robert, she said. Her voice was clear. The tremor was gone. Robert beamed. I knew you'd see reason, Mom. It's a lot of money. It ensures your comfort. Yes, Grandma said. You should tell them to call the owner. Robert chuckled, shaking his head. Mom, you're confused. I handle the business now. I'm the executor, or I will be. Technically, you and Dad are the owners, but given your situation, I'll be acting on your behalf. No, Grandpa said. He spoke from deep in his chest. He hadn't said a word since the blessing. He turned his head slowly and looked at his son. His eyes were milky, but his gaze was steady. No, Robert asked, his smile faltering. Dad, we just went over this. You can't manage this place. You are not the owner, Grandpa said. And neither are we. Robert put his knife down. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of a trap springing shut. "What are you talking about?" Robert asked. "Of course you're the owners. The deed is in your name. It has been since 1965. "Not anymore," Grandma said. She reached into the pocket of her oversized cardigan. Her hand moved slowly, trembling slightly, but with purpose. She pulled out a long white envelope. It wasn't a legal binder. It wasn't a fancy folder. It was a standard business envelope sealed with a piece of tape. She placed it on the table. She didn't slide it to Robert. She slid it to me. "Open it, Anne," she said. I looked at the envelope. My name was written on the front in Grandma's shaky looped cursive. Anne Simpson. I picked it up. The paper felt thick. I tore the end open. Inside was a document on blue-backed legal paper. At the top, in bold black letters, warranty deed. I read the first paragraph. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Know all men by these presents, that Arthur J. Simpson and Elise M. Simpson, husband and wife, grantors for and in consideration of the sum of $10, and other good and valuable consideration cash in hand, paid the receipt and sufficiency of which is hereby acknowledged, do hereby grant, bargain, sell, convey, and confirm unto Ann Simpson grantee." It listed the address, the plot numbers, the 50 acres, the house, the barn, the mineral rights. I looked at the bottom. It was signed Arthur J. Simpson, Elise M. Simpson, and below that a notary stamp, dated December 19th, 5 days ago. "Last Tuesday," Grandma said to the silent room, "a nice young woman came by, a mobile notary. You were at the dealership, Robert, buying your new lease. Anne was fixing the tractor." Robert stared at the paper in my hands. His face went from red to a pale waxen gray. "Let me see that," he demanded. He didn't wait. He reached across the table and snatched the paper from my hands. He read it. His eyes scanned the lines, frantically looking for a mistake, a loophole, a signature in the wrong place. This is ridiculous," he sputtered. $10, you sold a $2.5 million estate for $10. "And other good and valuable consideration," Grandpa said. "Read the whole line, Bob." "This won't stand," Robert said, his voice rising to a shout. He threw the paper down onto the cranberry sauce. "This is fraud. It's undue influence. Anne coerced you. She manipulated you while you were vulnerable." "I didn't know," I said. My voice was quiet, but it rang in the room. "I didn't know about this." "Bullshit!" Robert yelled. He stood up, knocking his chair back. It hit the floor with a crash. "You planned this. You've been working on them for months, poisoning them against us so you could steal the inheritance." "Sit down, Robert," Grandpa said. "I will not sit down. You're senile. Both of you. You don't know what you signed. You gave away everything." "Our legacy." "Your legacy?" Grandma asked. "You wanted to sell our legacy to a developer, Robert. You wanted to bulldoze the house your father was born in." "To pay for your care!" Robert screamed. "We have care," Grandpa said. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "We have Anne. She's a waitress, a gardener. She's not a professional." "She is family," Grandpa said. "She stayed." Robert turned to me. His face was twisted ugly with panic. "You can't keep this, Anne. I'll sue you. I'll drag you through court for years. I'll have them declared incompetent. I'll prove they didn't have the capacity to sign this." Grandpa reached into his vest pocket. He pulled out a smaller piece of paper folded in quarters. He placed it next to the deed. "Dr. Henderson came by an hour before the notary," Grandpa said. "He conducted a full cognitive evaluation on both of us. He signed an affidavit of mental competency. It's attached to the deed filed at the county clerk's office." Robert froze. "We anticipated you might be difficult," Grandpa said. "We know you, Bob. We know you're in trouble with the bank. We know you need this money." Chloe made a sound, a small, strangled gasp. She was looking at Robert. "Dad," she asked, "what do you mean, trouble?" Robert ignored her. He was staring at the competency affidavit. He knew what it meant. It meant the deed was ironclad. It meant the asset, the $2.5 million lifelines, was gone. "You can't do this," Robert whispered. "You can't just cut us out." "We didn't cut you out," Grandma said. "We left you the money in the savings account. There's about $5,000. You can split it." "5,000?" Linda screeched. "Bob owes—" She stopped herself, clamping her hand over her mouth. "Owes what?" I asked. I looked at them. The veneer was gone. The Hemingway honesty was all that was left. They weren't successful city people visiting the poor relations. They were desperate, broken people who had bet everything on a death that hadn't happened yet. "It's mine," I asked, looking at Grandma. "It's yours," she said. "The land, the house, the draft, the mice in the attic, all of it." "I don't want to sell it," I said. "We know," Grandpa said. "That's why you have the paper." I looked at Robert. He was leaning on the table, breathing hard. He looked old. "It's over, Dad," I said. "It's not over," he hissed. "You think you can run this place? You have no money, Anne. You can't pay the taxes on a commercial valuation. You'll be bankrupt in a year. You'll come crawling to me to sell it, and the offer will be gone." "I have the deed," I said. "And I have the house. I don't need the $2 million. "You're an idiot," Chloe spat. "You're a selfish, stubborn idiot. You're going to rot here." "Maybe," I said. "But it's my rot." I picked up the deed. I wiped a smear of cranberry sauce off the corner. It was heavy paper. It felt warm. "I think you should leave," I said. "This is my parents' house," Robert said. "Actually," I said, holding up the paper, "it's mine, and I'd like to finish my Christmas dinner in peace." Robert stared at me. He looked at the shotgun rack on the wall in the hallway. He looked at the determination in my face. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that I wasn't his little girl anymore. I was the woman who chopped the wood. I was the woman who killed the spiders. I was the woman who owned the ground he was standing on. "Fine," he said. "Fine. Keep the damn heap. See if I care when the roof caves in on you." He turned to Linda and Chloe. "Get your coats." "But the pie," Linda said, dazed. "We're leaving," Robert barked. He walked out of the dining room. He didn't say goodbye to his parents. He didn't look back. Linda followed, stumbling slightly. Chloe stood up. She looked at me, her eyes filled with hate and jealousy. "You planned this," she whispered. "I cooked the turkey, Chloe," I said. "That was my plan." She grabbed her wine glass, downed the rest of it in one gulp, and slammed it onto the table. The stem snapped. Red wine bled onto the white cloth. "Merry Christmas," she said, and walked out. I sat there. The front door slammed. The engine of the Mercedes roared to life, followed by the whine of the Porsche. I looked at the deed. I looked at Grandma and Grandpa. "Pass the potatoes, please," Grandpa said. The silence in the room didn't last. It was broken not by the wind, but by the sudden silence outside. The engines of the Mercedes and the Porsche, which had been revving aggressively, cut out. The quiet that followed was heavy. I looked at Grandpa. He had a forkful of mashed potatoes halfway to his mouth. He put it down. "They're not gone," he said. "No," I said. "They can't afford the gas." The front door opened. It didn't slam this time. It was pushed open with a slow, heavy reluctance. The cold draft swept down the hallway and curled around our ankles in the dining room. Robert stood in the archway. He still had his coat on, but it was unbuttoned now, hanging off him like a loose skin. Linda was behind him, her face pale against the dark fur of her scarf. Chloe lingered in the hallway, hugging herself, her mascara smeared in dark streaks under her eyes. They didn't look like invaders anymore. They looked like refugees. Robert walked into the room. He didn't sit down. He gripped the back of the chair he had thrown over moments before, his knuckles white. "We need to talk," he said. His voice was different. The boom was gone. It was tight, compressed by a panic he was trying to strangle. "We were talking," I said. "Then you left." "This is a mistake, Anne. A legal mistake. a moral one. It's a deed, Robert, I said. It's filed. You don't understand what you've done, he said, the anger flaring up again, hot and desperate. You've stolen an asset that belongs to the family estate. You've manipulated two elderly people into signing away their security. I can have this overturned. I can have you charged. I stood up. I didn't shout. I just put my hands flat on the table. They were scarred from the brambles and stained from the walnuts I'd husked in October. You want to talk about security? I asked. Where were you when the septic tank backed up last winter? Where were you when Grandma had the flu and couldn't get out of bed for 3 days? I was here. I was changing the sheets. I was carrying the water. I paid the property tax with the money I saved from selling the hay. You haven't put a dime into this place in 10 years. I have my own expenses, Robert snapped. I have a life. You have a life because I gave up mine, I said. I didn't steal this house. I earned it. Every shingle, every board. That's labor, Robert waved his hand dismissively. That's minimum wage work. You can't equate changing sheets with a $2.5 million asset. It's disproportionate. It's theft. He looked at his father. Dad, tell her. Tell her this was just a gesture. Tell her you didn't mean to give her the commercial rights. Just the house right, not the land value. Grandpa looked at his son. He didn't blink. I meant every acre, Bob. We are of sound mind. We just know who loves us and who loves the money. That's not fair, Linda said, her voice trembling. She stepped forward. We love you, Arthur. We just want you to be comfortable. I am comfortable, Grandpa said. I'm eating Anne's potatoes. Robert looked at the deed still sitting on the table. He looked at the red wine stain on the white cloth. He seemed to shrink inside his expensive coat. The anger drained out of him, leaving something hollow and terrifyingly honest. He pulled out the chair and sat down heavily. He put his face in his hands. I can't fix this, he whispered. Fix what? I asked. He looked up. His eyes were red. The loan. The bridge loan. I leveraged the firm against the inheritance. I showed the bank the appraisal for the farm. I told them the sale was guaranteed within the quarter. The truth hung in the air, ugly and naked. You borrowed money against a house you didn't own, I asked. I was going to own it. Robert slammed his hand on the table. It was the only way to float the payroll. The market turned Anne. The projects in the city, they stopped. I'm liquid only on paper. If I don't show the bank a path to capital by the first of the month they call the note, I lose the firm, I lose the house, I lose everything. Chloe made a sound from the doorway. She walked in her heels, clicking on the hardwood floor, unsteady. She looked at me, and the arrogance was gone, replaced by a terrified child. They're going to take the car, she said softly. The Porsche, I asked. I haven't made a payment in 4 months, she said. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand. I'm dodging the repo man. That's who the call was from. I thought if we sold the farm I could pay it off. I have credit card debt, Anne, a lot of it. I can't lose the car. I need it for my image, for the agency. You don't have an agency, Chloe, I said. You have an Instagram account. It's the same thing, she cried, her voice cracking. You don't get it. You live out here in the dirt. You don't know what it costs to be someone. Linda began to cry, a soft weeping sound. We're overextended, Anne. We're drowning. The club dues, the mortgage. We were counting on this. We already spent it in our heads. I looked at them. The 3 of them stripped of their pretensions. They were poor, poorer than me. I had a drafty farmhouse and $10 in the bank, but I owned the ground I stood on. They owned nothing but debt and the appearance of wealth. They were hollowed out by their own appetites. The mood in the room shifted. The anger was gone. The denial was gone. Now came the bargaining. It was sickening. The tone turned sweet, cloying, desperate. Robert leaned forward. He tried to smile. It looked like a grimace. Anne, he said gently. Annie, look. We're family. We're in this together. Okay, you have the deed. You won. That's great. You secured the asset. Smart. I taught you well. He reached out to touch my hand. I pulled it back. But listen, he continued undeterred. You can't handle a development deal like this alone. Vantage properties. They're sharks. They'll eat you alive. You need a partner. Someone who knows the game. I'm not playing a game, I said. We can structure it, Robert said, talking faster now, his hands moving. We form a trust. You put the land in. I manage the development. We split the proceeds. You get 40%. 40% of 2.5 million. That's $1 million, Anne. $1 million. You can fix the house. You can travel. You can buy a whole new wardrobe. You can help Chloe. Chloe looked at me, her eyes wide and wet. Please, Anne, I'll be nice, I promise. I'll come visit more. I'll help with the garden. Just don't let them take my car. We can all win here, Linda added, nodding eagerly. We can hire proper nurses for Mom and Dad. The best. You wouldn't have to work so hard. You look so tired, honey. Let us help you carry the burden. They were offering to sell my home to save their vanity. They were offering me a fraction of my own property in exchange for destroying it. They saw the deed not as a boundary, but as a negotiating chip. I looked at the fire in the wood stove. It was burning down to coals. I would need to add another log soon. I looked at the window. The snow was falling harder now, erasing the tire tracks they had made coming in. I looked at the deed. Then I looked at Robert. No, I said. Anne, be reasonable, Robert pleaded. 50%. We'll split it down the middle. 1.25 million. You can't say no to that. I can, I said. I like this house. I like the draft. I like the way the floor slopes in the hallway. It's a teardown, Robert shouted, the mask slipping again. It's garbage. It's mine, I said. I stood up and picked up the deed. I walked over to the sideboard and placed it in the drawer with the silverware. I closed the drawer. The sound was final. The dinner is over, I said. You can't do this, Robert said. He was shaking. You are ruining us. You ruined yourselves, I said. You spent money you didn't have on things you didn't need, and you waited for your parents to die to pay the bill. I looked at Chloe. Sell the car, Chloe. Buy a Honda. Get a job. I looked at Linda. Cancel the club. Learn to cook. I looked at Robert. Tell the bank the truth. It's liberating. You're a bitch, Chloe said. The venom was back, but it was weak now. I'm the owner, I repeated. I started to clear the table. I stacked the plates, scraping the leftover turkey onto the top one. I took the wine glasses, careful with the broken stem. I worked methodically. I didn't look at them. Please leave, I said. I have to wash the dishes, and Grandpa needs his nap. Robert stood up. He looked at the room one last time. He looked at the peeling wallpaper he had mocked, the floorboards he had disparaged. He realized that this heap was the only solid thing in his life, and he had lost it. Come on, he said to Linda. His voice was dead. Bob, Linda whispered. There's nothing here for us, he said. He walked to the door. He didn't look back at his parents. He looked defeated, a man whose ledger had finally balanced out to zero. Chloe followed, sobbing openly, now checking her phone as if a miracle might appear on the screen. Linda lingered for a second, looking at the grandma. Merry Christmas, Mom, she said weakly. Grandma didn't answer. She was watching me clear the table. The door opened and closed. The cold rushed in, and then was cut off. I heard the engines start again. They sounded strained in the cold air. The tires crunched on the gravel, slipping, finding traction, and then fading away down the long driveway. The house was quiet. The only sound was the fire popping and the clink of silverware as I gathered it up. The heavy, suffocating pressure of their greed was gone. The air felt lighter, cleaner. I carried the stack of plates to the kitchen. The water in the sink would be cold, but I would boil a kettle. I would make it warm. The red taillights of the Mercedes and the Porsche lingered for a moment at the end of the long driveway, two pairs of angry eyes glowing in the darkness before they turned onto the county road and vanished behind the tree line. I watched them go from the front window. The glass was cold against my forehead. The snow was falling steadily now, filling in the ruts their tires had carved into the gravel, erasing the evidence of their visit. In an hour, the driveway would be a pristine, unbroken sheet of white again. It was as if they had never been here. I locked the front door. The deadbolt slid home with a heavy, solid thunk. It was a sound I had heard 1,000 times, but tonight it sounded different. It sounded like the closing of a vault. I turned off the entryway light, plunging the hall into shadow, and walked back to the dining room. The room was still warm, smelling of roasted meat and the lingering acidic scent of the spilled wine. The violence of the last hour hung in the air like smoke, but it was already thinning, dissipating into the corners of the high ceiling. Grandpa was still sitting at the head of the table. He hadn't moved. His hands were folded on the tablecloth right next to the stain. Grandma was looking at the fire in the wood stove, watching the logs settle and crumble into glowing embers. They looked tired, their skin like parchment paper in the candlelight, but they didn't look frail. They looked like the old oak trees on the south ridge, weathered, scarred, but rooted so deep nothing could knock them over. "They're gone," I said. "I know," Grandpa said. He didn't look up. "Bob always drove too fast on ice. He never learned to respect the weather." "He has a lot on his mind," Grandma said softly. There was no malice in her voice, just a sad, resigned understanding. He always wanted more than he could carry. I began to clear the rest of the table. I picked up the broken wine glass, careful not to cut myself on the jagged stem. I gathered the napkins, the silver forks, the heavy serving platters. The domestic rhythm took over, soothing the adrenaline that was still spiking in my blood. I carried the dishes to the kitchen, scraping the plates, running the hot water. The steam rose up, warming my face. I scrubbed the roasting pan. The steel wool rasped against the metal. It was a hard, honest sound. When the kitchen was clean, I took the apple pie out of the pantry. I had made it yesterday, peeling the apples from the cellar, rolling the dough out on the marble slab. It was cold, but the crust was flaky and golden. I cut 3 large slices. I put them on the dessert plates, the everyday ones, not the china. I poured fresh coffee into mugs, strong and black, just the way Grandpa liked it, even though the doctor said no caffeine after noon. Tonight the rules didn't apply. I carried the tray back into the dining room. I set a piece of pie in front of Grandpa and another in front of Grandma. I sat down in my chair, not the side chair, but the one Robert had vacated. The wood was still warm from him, but I claimed it. I took a sip of coffee. It was bitter and hot. "How is the pie?" I asked. Grandpa took a bite. He chewed slowly, savoring it. "Tart," he said. "Good apples this year." "It's the northern spies," I said. "They keep well." We ate in silence for a while. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a companionable one. We didn't need to dissect what had happened. We didn't need to analyze Robert's debts or Chloe's cruelty. The facts were on the table, as clear as the deed in the drawer. "You knew," I said eventually, "about Robert, about the money." "People talk," Grandma said. "Mrs. Higgins at the bank, she mentioned a few things. And Bob, he has a tell. When he's lying, he talks about logic. When he's scared, he talks about money." "He's in deep," Grandpa said. He put his fork down. "I feel bad for him. A man shouldn't be that afraid of his own life." "He wanted to sell us," I said. "He wanted to save himself," Grandpa corrected. "There's a difference, but we couldn't let him do it. Not to you, and not to this place." I looked around the room. I really looked at it. The water stain on the ceiling that Chloe had mocked, the worn spots on the rug, the draft coming from the window sash. Before today, those things had looked like failures to me. They were items on a to-do list I couldn't afford to finish. They were evidence of my stagnation. Now they looked different. They were mine. The draft wasn't a defect. It was the house breathing. The peeling paint wasn't poverty. It was history. And the land, the 50 acres of soil and rock and snow outside was no longer just a burden of taxes and upkeep. $2.5 million. I let the number sit in my mind. I didn't want the money. I didn't want the condo or the clothes or the travel. I realized with a sudden crystal clarity that the value of the land wasn't in what I could buy with it. The value was in what I could refuse. The money was a shield. It was a wall I could build around this life to keep the world out. I could sell the timber rights if I needed a new roof. I could lease the lower pasture if the taxes went up. But I didn't have to sell the heart of it. I had options. I had freedom. I wasn't the poor relation taking care of the grandparents because I had nowhere else to go. I was the owner. I was the steward. I'm not going to sell, I said. Not for 2 million, not for 10. We know, Grandma said. She reached out and patted my hand. Her skin was dry and cool. That's why we gave it to you. Bob would have sold it before we were cold in the ground. You'll stay. I'll stay, I promised. I finished my coffee. I stood up and went to the sideboard. I opened the drawer and took out the envelope with the deed. I didn't need to read it again. I just needed to hold it. I walked over to the old roll-top desk in the corner, the one where Grandpa used to keep the farm ledgers. I unlocked the bottom drawer with the skeleton key on my ring. I placed the deed inside on top of the birth certificates and the insurance policies. I locked it. I'm going to check the animals, I said. Put a coat on, Grandma said. It's bitter out. I put on my canvas jacket. I pulled on my boots. I walked out onto the porch. The cold hit me like a physical blow, sharp and cleansing. The snow had stopped, and the clouds were breaking apart. The moon was rising full and bright, turning the snow-covered fields into a sea of blue-white silver. The air smelled of ice and pine. I walked down the steps. I didn't go to the barn. I just stood in the driveway looking back at the house. The windows were glowing with warm yellow light. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, rising straight up into the still air. It didn't look like a shack. It didn't look like a teardown. It looked like a castle. It looked invincible. I thought of Chloe in her leased Porsche, terrified of a phone call. I thought of Robert in his mortgaged mansion, unable to sleep. They were the ones who were homeless. They were the ones drifting, tethered to nothing but debt and the perception of others. I dug my boot into the snow, feeling the hard, frozen earth beneath it. This was real. The dirt, the wood, the deed in the desk. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the freezing air. I felt strong. I felt awake. I turned back to the house. I walked up the steps, the wood solid under my feet. I paused at the door and looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the storm door. I didn't see a tired girl in a flannel shirt. I saw a woman who held the line. I saw the matriarch of the Simpson farm. I reached out and flipped the switch for the porch light. The darkness rushed in from the fields, wrapping around the house, protective and quiet. I opened the door and went inside, closing it firmly against the cold. The lock clicked. I was home. As the lights of the farmhouse fade into the quiet winter night, Anne finally understands that true ownership is not about the price of the land, but the strength to keep it. If you enjoyed this journey of resilience and justice, please consider subscribing to the channel. What would you have done in Anne's position? Leave a comment below. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.